Okay, so if you didn't make it last weekend, I briefly mentioned that in that gospel reading, the 5 foolish virgins perplexed me because having a lantern with very little oil is indeed quite foolish. Not stocking up on faith, the fire of life, is indeed foolish. That's the point of that story. Today's gospel story of talents, it's pretty much the same message, but the secular side of things. We all have talents. That's the gold coins. They represent the gifts that God has given us to work with. And the vast majority of us have at least one to work with. A person who has literally nothing to work with is rare. I'm talking about children who don't live very long. I'm talking about people who are so mentally disadvantaged, they basically don't have free will, and they need someone to take care of them their entire lives. Okay, those people exist, but they are exceedingly rare. Most of us, even the most humble and undereducated among us, have something to work with. With that in mind, who are you in this story? Are you the first or second guy who applies his gifts to the best of their ability? Or are you that third guy who literally does nothing with what he's been given? It sounds obvious when I say it like that, because it is obvious when you get down to it. It's not quite as obvious when we get lost in our heads and we start thinking about life in our terms rather than God's. That's when we get worked up with silly things like cost-benefit analysis. We get worried about losing what we have to the point where we end up fearing everything and nothing. I'm not going to college. What if I can't handle it and I get a bunch of debt for nothing? I can't tell him or her how I feel. What if they don't feel the same way? Here's a big one. Priests hear this in the confessional more often than you might think. I can't quit my job, which is literally killing me. My family will literally starve to death. These are things the third guy says to himself, and they're excuses born of fear. Okay? It's fear. Let's call a spade a spade. We're human beings, and fear is a major factor in our decision-making process. Priests included. Okay? I gave you 3 garden variety fears that keep us from acting appropriately. Here's a priestly one for you. I can't enforce Catholic teaching in this case. What if they leave the parish and abandon their faith completely? Now, no comment about how often I listen to that voice or how often I resist that voice. But that voice is fear. It is fear more than anything else, and fear keeps us from using our talents appropriately. Most talents are not improved by fear. There are a few exceptions, like running away from wild, rabid animals. Okay, fine. Fear is probably going to help you in that way. Most of the time, with fear, we focus on what we might lose, and so we gain nothing. And that is not a life well lived. I once heard, courage is the willingness to try and fail. It's true. Some gambles are dumb. Sometimes you really are just throwing your gold coins away. Don't do that. But if you've thought things through, if you know what God is calling you to do, then more often than not, it is courageous. to take the plunge and be willing to try and fail. It's okay. Even if you fail, you are probably learning something, and you will be less likely to fail in the future. That's life. More precisely, that's life experience. Life experience is a huge source of where wisdom comes from, and it will involve failure from time to time. But if you can't bring yourself to even try, you end up doing nothing and gaining nothing. I mention every once in a while, the first time I went on vacation to Japan, I went with another group of Americans because I didn't want to be there alone. And one girl in our group, she studied Japanese in college, like I think for the entire 4 years. I don't think it was her major, but she studied it. So when we were in Japan, on paper, she probably understood the language much better than I did if we were, tested equally or something. But the thing is, our entire time with her, I was there for 2 weeks, she was there longer, she never spoke Japanese. She was afraid of sounding like a dumb American. She was afraid of offending somebody. She was afraid of doing it wrong. And so she never spoke it. She just spoke English. And she learned nothing and gained nothing. I don't have that problem. I don't care if I look like a stupid American overbroad. I am a stupid American. I might as well practice. That's how you gain. Your failures will teach you just as much as your victories. And by the by, on this little subtopic, one of my favorite quotes from Aristotle. He said, the best way to avoid criticism, the best way to avoid the disapproval of others, is to say nothing and think nothing and be nothing. In that way, you won't be criticized. Who knows, maybe today's gospel would have been Aristotle's favorite story in the Bible, had he, lived long enough to read it in the first place. In any event, this is ultimately the point of our story in the gospel today. The third person, he who refuses to act, refuses to gain. Therefore, use your talents that you may present to God a rich and glorious profit margin, but not a profit margin of silver and gold, but of life's true treasures of faith, hope, and love. For they are what give your talents their weightiness and their splendor.